Hey, what's up, Kingdom Church family? This is Home in 5, where we get to come into your home for about 5 minutes and encourage you in the midst of everything that we're going through. I've been reading Hebrews chapter number 10, and it's really been encouraging me in my faith. I even preached about it a couple of weeks ago. And I was reading Hebrews 10:32 through 36, and we see the writer of Hebrews encouraging a bunch of Christians who are being severely persecuted. Now, persecution and suffering are not uncommon to the New Testament. In fact, most of the churches were facing some sort of persecution. And we get to understand as we read the New Testament that suffering was never meant to hurt us, but rather to refine us and push us into a deeper relationship and dependence on God. And so I see three things in the text that encourage me. The first thing was in verse 32, the writer tells them to recall the former days. I can't help but to think back on times in my life where I was going through something and I've forgotten that God had brought me through something like that before. The writer is essentially saying the same thing to these people who are being persecuted. He is telling these Christians to stand firm in the face of what they're going through because they've been here before. You can stand firm because if God brought you out of something before, why wouldn't He do that now? And I think that's a word to all of us to always recall the former days of what God has brought us through. The second thing he says to this group of Christians, he tells them to regain their confidence. He tells them, don't throw away their confidence, for it has great reward. I can't help but to think, but that confidence is coming to God humbly and saying, God, I can't, but you can. Confidence is not saying that I have an answer or I have a plan, but rather I'm all out of answers and I need to put my confidence in you. And so when I put my confidence in you, my confidence grows in who I am through you. You know, I can remember going through a tough season of ministry, and to top it out, not only was I going through a tough season of ministry, but I had lost a loved one. I had lost a loved one whom I love very much, and I felt like I was losing my confidence that God would take away the pain, my confidence that God was walking with me. And I remember being reminded while I was going through this that maybe God wouldn't take away the pain, but rather He would stand with me while I'm going through the pain. And I got to find out how much putting my confidence in God mattered, that He lifted my head from being in this sorrowful place to bringing my confidence back and trusting Him. The writer encourages us not to throw away our confidence. But not only does he say recall the former days, and not only does he say to regain our confidence, but lastly, he says to remember the promise. I love this in verse 36 that he encourages them to remember that there is a promise on the backside of standing firm in their faith while facing persecution. Can I tell you that I've sat down at the table with my son before, my 2-year-old toddler, and he does not like vegetables. In fact, he'd rather just eat sugar. And so I remember one night trying to get my son to eat his vegetables. I had to bribe him. So I told him I would give him a muffin if he ate his vegetables. And he chopped his vegetables down to get this muffin. And he got down from the table and he didn't even remember that I promised him a muffin. And it wasn't until right before bed that he looks at me and he says, Dad, I want my muffin. He remembered the promise that I made to him. Can I tell you something? That sometimes we can be the same way with God. That God makes us a promise and we can forget, but man, that promise is etched in the back of our heads that God made us a promise. And this promise that He makes to these Christians is not a promise of more money or a bigger house or a bigger salary, but rather the promise is the promise of eternity. Heaven is the greatest promise that we could ever receive. And can I tell you, what makes us stand strong today is that we will get to spend eternity with God. So the writer tells us not only to remember the days when God came through, but we need to recall the promises and we need to regain our confidence. And I pray today that you will recall, that you would regain your confidence, and that you will remember God's promises towards you. I hope this is encouraging to you. Thank you for allowing us to come into your home for about 5 minutes to encourage you. We can't wait to see you next week and all the weeks to come.